Okay, so you in a sense have a glimpse of what it meant to be in New York during the Gulf War for people on the margins, as it were, uh, of the American media in terms of not simply the war in the Gulf, but also how it was affecting people in Israel, Palestine. But living in New York, and this experience was also addressing some kind of a taboo relationship that is between Palestinian from Israel and an Iraqi Israeli in the context of New York. I mean, two kind of experiences that are related, and we also went to Israel together at some point. We were also experiencing, so there was a kind of an ongoing dialogue, and particularly around the question of cinema. I mean, it's on the one hand you have here the experiences of war and the pain and the trauma around war, and my desire to assert the question of the Arab Jew that I have, for those familiar, have been trying to work on for a long time, insisting on the question of the hyphen, inserting it between the Arab and the Jew. But here, I mean, there was also a question of cinema and cinema's history and how to understand the representation of those issues. So you have on the one hand, which also appears in the book, a certain kind of analogy that is created between American cinema and Israeli cinema. The notion of the encounter in the Western between the cowboy and the Indian, as it were, being reproduced or echoed in the whole question of the Americans meeting the natives, as it were. In the context of the history of Israeli cinema, it has been, and you can see it in the old Israeli films, where Palestinians, or the Arabs as they're called, are often represented in a way that is very much similar to the Indians in the Western genre. So there is a logic here for this cinematic analogy. Then some of the footage that is taken, and I think it's fascinating to think about the flags in the film, between the Palestinian flag, the Israeli flag, the Iraqi flag, the images of Iraq that are archival footage, coming actually from a more official narrative about the history of Iraqi Jews, but here taken for a different kind of narrative, a kind of identification, as it were, between a Palestinian and an Iraqi Jewish woman. So I think this is sort of like, to an extent, it questions the very notion of what does it mean to be Israeli and what does it mean, especially, or Arab Israeli, as officially Palestinians in Israel are defined, and to be a Jewish Israeli when your Arabness as an Iraqi has been suppressed and repressed. So,
I wanted to basically pick up on this, that actually it has been a struggle for the Palestinians of Israel to be called Palestinians and not to be called Arabs. And
just as, I mean, for Jews from Arab countries to even assert themselves and to call themselves, even the common term Mizrahim hasn't been simple. That is the Orientals, which went against this idea of simply Jews or Jews from the tribes of the Orient. The Orient.
But there was a moment when you decided to take Arab and Israeli and Jew and empower it and basically reverse the crime in 1492 and reverse that tragedy, the burden of tragedy, and organize a conference in Toledo, in Andalusia, in 1989. Do you want just to talk about this, the importance of this conference?
Yeah, I mean, this is like we're just a little bit over 20 years after this incredible conference that I feel very honored and proud to have been part of. It was a conference that actually, in the wake of, the whole celebration, preparation for the commemoration of the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from Iberia. This was there were also efforts to remember Jews and Muslims in one way, and this is pre-Madrid meetings in which Spain, and pre-Oslo, where Spain actually took an active role, and the Spanish University in Toledo decided to have Palestinians and Arab Jews, Sephardic Jews, whether Israelis or citizens of Morocco or France or the US, come together for a meeting which hopefully would generate. And many of us were part of different organizations, such as Perspective Judeo-Arab, which was largely located in Paris, but also was connected to Israel, or here in New York, World Organization of Jews from Muslim countries, which was had a representation at the UN on the question of Palestine. So it wasn't this, and some of them were old Black Panthers also who came to that conference. So Mahmoud Darwish was on the Palestinian side. I mean, it was intellectuals, politicians, but the idea was to try to draw inspiration from the convivencia of Jews and Muslims and Christians in Spain and try to reimagine something for the future. And this was the context in which intellectuals, writers, activists were invited under the same roof to try to imagine what it would mean. And I think for me, I mean, obviously as part of my personal history, but I think within the history of this type of dialogue, it represented something else, because it was not the two enemies coming and meeting together, which is usually how...
It was not a reconciliation.
It was not a reconciliation, no.
It was forging a new space.
Forging a new space with the idea that we have also a shared history.
Yes.
And it's sort of like remembering toward the future, as it were. And, you know, if I could, you know, it was incredible to me that in the 20th anniversary, I almost wanted to write something and was hoping that something would be written about it. But, you know, I think there is time still also to remember that Toledo meeting, especially since some key figures have passed away in the last couple of years, like Naim Giladi Khlaschi,
Edmond Maleh, Jacques Hassoun, Ibrahim
Sarfati, you know, many key figure of among, and Mahmoud Darwish, both on the Palestinian and the
Samir
yeah. So
okay, so this Toledo meeting was pivotal in asserting, in an intellectual realm, a positive value or potentiality to Arab Jew, to this identity, the Arab Jew, and the hyphen to carry a positive potentiality. So the next clip we will see is from a film called Forget Baghdad. Forget Baghdad, the full title is actually Forget Baghdad, Jews and Arabs, the Iraqi Connection. And this is the film that crystallizes this, the hyphenation and the rewriting, proposes a complete rewriting of history, and tries to imagine or uncovers new possibilities for writing the self in history, in the nation, in the space, but also in the future. The director is Samir. Samir is a Swiss Iraqi. He draws the portrait of Iraqi communist Jews who are in Israel or were in Israel. Shimon Ballas, writer, novelist, very critically acclaimed and very eloquent, very accomplished. Musa or Moshe Houri. Sami Mikhail, also extremely well-known writer in Israel. Samir Naqqash, who is a remarkable poet because he still writes in the Baghdadi Jewish dialect. And Professor Ella Shohat. Do you want to just set up a bit?
Yeah, I think Samir, whom actually contacted me when he was trying to work on a film that no one wanted to support, because why a non-Jew Iraqi Swiss would want to make a film about Jews? And so there was a lot of questions and suspicion when he was trying to raise funds in Europe to make the film. And originally the film was just supposed to be about those 4 writers, activists, who represented a generational piece, a portraiture of an Iraq that is gone, but an Iraq that also lives in Israel, and Jews who live this paradoxical entity or experience of being an Arab Jew, especially in the context of Israel or after the partition of Palestine. I was actually in the role of advising the film, but then Samir wanted me to be part of the film. And that was the point where I suggest, well, if I'm part of the film, then you have to bring your story into the film. And that's how the notion of the diasporic Iraqis came into place. In a sense, we were thinking, he grew up in Switzerland, I grew up in Israel, I moved later to New York. So we have a complex relationship, which once again brings up to the question of borders and how cinema, even when it's defined as a Swiss film, cannot be thought of as simply a Swiss film. It won an award at the Locarno Film Festival, but it obviously portrays multiple axes. The axis of Shimon Balas between Tel Aviv and Paris, and the axis of Iraq for Samir between Switzerland and Iraq. So you have between Baghdad and Haifa for Sami Mikhail, between Baghdad and Petah Tikva for Samir Naqash, who continued until he passed away recently, continued to write in Arabic and not in Hebrew despite his transition into Israel. The sequence we're going to show you
is it's kind of a famous sequence because it's an interview with Ella right after the publication of her book on Israeli TV, on the only public TV channel then. And it is an interview that caught a lot of attention and basically made the uproar about the book even more louder. We will see it and then conclude.
Writing a book on Israeli cinema was not just writing about Israeli cinema. For me, it was an attempt to understand what has happened to the people in Israel. It was also a way of looking at culture and specifically at cinema and how cinema has a very important role in the way we imagine other groups of people and more importantly, how we imagine ourselves. Well, it's in a sense adapting the view of the dominant perspective about you. Thus were images that were propagated, but at the same time, we ended up believing them.
I hadn't imagined before that a book on film history would be able to shake the political elite of a whole country as Ella's book.
I think the fact that it was making links between the Mizrahi issue, the Palestinian issue, the questions of gender, I think was too much to take. Segment. Just one example of how the book was received in Israel, the book on Israeli cinema, but this one is from a popular talk show on Israeli television where I was interviewed.
אני חושבת שהעניין הזה פשוט, זה רק דוגמה, אוקיי? דוגמה סמלית, אלא על האוריינטציה שלנו שהיא מערבית. עכשיו, כיוון שישראל ממוקמת במזרח התיכון, וכיוון שהרוב הוא בכל זאת מזרחי, נשאלת השאלה, מה זה אומר כלפי תרבות שרואה את עצמה רק כמערבית? מה זה אומר כלפי הציבור המזרחי שיושב כאן? אוקיי, זה אומר שיש לו קונפליקט בזהות שלו.
לא, אבל את אומרת את זה, תסתכלי דוקטור שוחט, את אומרת האינטרס זה מוטיבציה, כן? לשלול את מזרחיותה של ישראל. כלומר, אני הבנתי מתוך זה שהאינטרסים של האשכנזים במדינת ישראל הם לשלול את מזרחיותם של החלק המזרחי, כלומר, לשכנז אותם, למערב אותם. מה פתאום?
ואני חושבת שזה נורא נחמד להגיד את זה בקולנוע. זאת אומרת, אחד המוטיבים הקלאסיים בקולנוע הישראלי זה נישואי תערובת בין מזרחים לאשכנזים.
לא, בקולנוע, גם בחיים.
גם בחיים זה רק 20%, אוקיי? אבל אנחנו מדברים על הקולנוע, הפרופורציות בין נישואי התערובת לבין מה שקורה במציאות, זה חוסר פרופורציה. עכשיו, נשאלת השאלה, למה יש סיפורי עלילה כאלה שמתמקדים בנישואי תערובת? זה נורא נחמד והקומדיות נורא יפות ומעניינות. אבל נשאלת השאלה, מה קורה בנישואי התערובת הללו? זאת אומרת, ההנחה היא בדרך כלל, וסלאח שבתי, אני חושבת פשוט הוא דוגמה מאוד מוכרת לכולם, אז אני אשתמש פשוט בסלאח שבתי. הילדים של סלאח שבתי, כמובן, שייקה לוי וגאולה נוני, ההנחה היא שבסוף הסרט הם אשכנזים, כלומר, הופכים לצברים, אוקיי?
אבל כל זה, אני פשוט חייב להפסיק אותה, כל זה עדיין לא אומר שיש לחלק האשכנזי של מדינת ישראל עניין, ואני עכשיו רואים טיפה את רמת הדיון האקדמית שפתחת, לדכא, וזה מה שאת חושבת, את המזרחים במדינת ישראל. ספרתי היום ברשימת חברי הכנסת, 37 חברי כנסת מעדות המזרח. את למשל טוענת שבאוניברסיטאות כמעט שאין מזרחיים. ביקרת בזמן האחרון באוניברסיטה בישראל? חלה בניו יורק, אני יודע.
בהחלט. אני לא צריכה לבקר לדעת...
אין הרבה עדות מזרח?
לא, בהחלט. בפרופורציה לאוכלוסייה, אחוז המזרחים מאוד נמוך, וככל שעולה רמת ההשכלה, ככה יש פחות מזרחים באוניברסיטאות.
בגלל שהאשכנזים מעוניינים שיהיו פחות ישראלים באוניברסיטה בישראל?
יש בהחלט מערכת של טעוני טיפוח, יש בהחלט מערכת, ואני חושבת שכאן אני רוצה לציין את ארגון הילה, כארגון נהדר שיש בו נתונים סטטיסטיים על מי מופנה לאיזושהי מערכת חינוך ומי מופנה לאיזושהי מערכת חינוך אחרת.
ולכן... יש גזענות בישראל?
בהחלט.
יש גזענות אולי כלפי ערבים, אבל לא כלפי יהודים אזרחים.
זה אתה החלטת.
אני לא החלטתי, אני מציע לך תזה.
לא. אני רוצה שתשאל מזרחים מה הם חושבים. עכשיו, יש מזרחים
יש לנו פה שומעים יש בקהל. מי פה מעדות המזרח קהל? תרימו ידיים עכשיו. אתם מרגישים שהאשכנזים רוצים לדפוק אתכם באיזושהי דרך? כן?
Yeah, I was surprised. I didn't expect him to speak to the audience. I mean, it was a surprise. And I was not sure whether the audience would say, whether they would agree with me either. And it was a wonderful surprise for him too, because he was very arrogant. He did, certainly by disrespecting what I had to say, but also he certainly, and you see how obviously he does not know what to do with himself. Totally disorientation for this very confident man who suddenly has to face a reality of people saying, no, there is racism toward us. This is the first time, to my knowledge, that it was heard on Israeli television, certainly in a live show.
After the controversy over her book, Ella decided to remain in New York. Since then, her parents have joined her to live in an Arab Jewish neighborhood in Brooklyn. When Ella shows me her favorite place, the Hudson reminds me of the broad Tigris in Baghdad.
One of the reasons why I ended up in New York is partially very much connected to an exile that someone like myself, even though I was born in Israel, felt because I was Iraqi, because later on of my political perspectives and the fact that there was very little room for people like myself in a society that did not want to hear the voice of an Iraqi critique. So I'm saying, you might call it exile, but how can you speak of exile in the age of communication and in the late 20th century? That idea of exile, it's not like...
So we come back to the book. The book, you wanted to deconstruct the national space, the national imagined space, the space of a colonizer, the imagined space of a colonizer. And you wrote the postscript, and we said that it doesn't fit in area studies. It didn't really match their proclivity, and it preceded post-colonial studies. It spoke the language of cultural studies before cultural studies stood on its feet.
Or around the time of cultural studies.
Yeah, but it was still new. Today, when you write the postscript, we are at an interesting time. First of all, there was the Oslo Accords. We are talking about a post-Zionist moment. We're certainly in a post-colonial moment. It is interesting that the way Israeli intellectual life has experienced post-coloniality, because Frantz Fanon was only translated a few years ago to Hebrew, and Ella actually wrote the postscript to that book. So it is interesting how the references for post-colonial studies come outside Israel, and how they enter, at which moment they enter in Israel. There is a revisionist cinema. How do you see, so the postscript, I think, could have been a book in itself, but in the scholarship, I think the book...
The publisher didn't want it, so it got attached. It is still a very vanguard book, because it still occupies that strange position that cannot fit categories. You are still very much a child of the Marxists, but the dogmatics will never take you home. You are certainly not somebody who is thrilled about identity politics, actually. You are in this, you propose very strange categories: cinema, citizenship. You want to restore hyphens when the world wants to remove hyphens. Just give us just a sense of this postscript, and as a scholarly work, just frame, the Yeah, I think Sumita's introduction in a way touched a little bit, and I want to go back and sort of like come back to your comment about the present. At the time when it was written, certainly the debates that were mostly critical and available within public academic intellectual discourses were around the question of third world film and literature. And that was the space in which even the critique of racism within the US and elsewhere, it was kind of a large rubric. This is pre even the term multiculturalism. So of course for me, when I had the option of different publishers, University of Texas Press made most sense to me precisely because they had a series in third world cinema and literature, and that's where I felt intellectually most at home, precisely because there was an acceptance of that. By the way, when the dissertation was submitted to the press, one of the reviewers sent it back and said, in no way, the book should not in any way be published. And almost every paragraph he wrote PLO propaganda. And, I didn't see myself as even if I wanted to, I don't think I'm a good propagandist in terms of the kind of writing I write. But nonetheless, that's how it was understood, precisely because I think it took on board a Palestinian point of view, and that and contextualize it within a larger project of decolonization. And that was, and at the same time, I did not simply reproduce, I was also trying to suggest that there are some anomalies in the context of Zionism, the question of return, and that must be addressed, at least on the emotional and the structure of feelings around those issues. But at the time, and then when post-colonialism as a field of study emerges, I published an essay, which of course I took it on board, but at the same time I critiqued the term post-colonial, while at the same time coming to an extent, for those of you from post-structuralist perspectives, and also from this kind of refusal of identity politics, if it means essentialized fixed categories of identities. But I think sometimes identity politics also receive the backlash that sometimes I feel like I have to defend it, because in the context of in which feminist, multiculturalists in the 90s have been attacked very much, because presumably it's all about fixity of identities, when in fact it was also about gender, race, class oppression. So that's the context where the politics of identity, rather than perhaps identity politics, has been crucial as a mode of analysis. But what happens in the context of Israel when the book comes out, when the book is written? Imagine a space where in the rest, when Sumita, for example, writes her dissertation, there is already a long history in India of anti-colonial writings. There is. So when the post-colonials who are identified, for example, with Homi Bhabha or Gayatri Spivak, they already have a tradition of anti-colonial texts that they converse with and they can transcend and move beyond. But I was writing in a context where, except for a few intellectual radicals like Matzpen or some of the left of the Black Panthers, and of course among Palestinians, but I'm speaking about Jews, there was no such culture or critique. So even the 60s, where a lot of countries have gone through the 60s and rebellions of the 60s, are, in late 60s in Israel is the euphoria of the 67 war. So there is a kind of a disjuncture, and yet, Frantz Fanon is not translated. Albert Memmi is not translated. Sort of like the classical writing of anti-colonial writings are not available in Hebrew. They're available in Arabic, they're available, of course, in French, in English, in Portuguese, all Spanish, multiple languages, in Farsi, but they're not in Turkish, but not in Hebrew. So what happens, and I think post-Oslo Accords, and that's where, with all the problems of Oslo Accords, what happens, there is a gradual interest or openness, as it were. You can call it the openness of Israeli discourse toward critical writings. But I think we cannot separate it from what has been happening in the Anglo-American academe, which is an incredible source of reference for Hebrew writing. And with the rise of multiculturalism, post-colonial studies, that begins to travel. And I was often disturbed how even in the most critical spaces in Israel, Edward Said's Orientalism up to 2000 was not translated, and yet there was already in 95, 96 eagerness to go beyond Edward Said's Orientalism and to critique him as binarist, in contrast, and kind of ultimately, binarism is a bad word, of course, and an essentialist, ultimately, reproducing an East-West dichotomy, unlike the more complex work of Homi Bhabha. And this has been very disturbing in that in the first essay translated by Homi Bhabha to Hebrew involves the editor's critique of Edward Said. So I never thought it was a coincidence, the politics of translation in itself, what is skipped, what is translated, is in itself has a political dimension, whether conscious or unconscious. So The Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon book, only gets to be translated in 2006. And so you can imagine what it meant to have a book that begins with homage to someone like Frantz Fanon and Edward Said and Albert Memmi in a context where this work has never really existed. Not to mention even some of the post-structuralist writings, So this was both the theoretical vacuum, and then for the American audiences or the English-speaking audiences, there was an expectation that this is a certain kind of a Jewish studies or area studies book, when in fact the whole point was to undo those borders of identity.
And one of the phenomena of post-Zionism is to void notions or terms like Arab Jew of their political meaning, right? Because now it's fashionable to be an Arab Jew. There's money for conferences, for travel.
Yeah, I mean, the sad reality is that whatever begins, as we know, as avant-garde, often ends up appropriated and re-articulated in ways that ultimately reproduce certain kind of safe, dominant or hegemonic paradigms. And I think one of the paradoxes or ironies of the very concept of post-Zionism, and while it has been celebrated, especially in the late 90s in the American context, where a lot of revisionist historians' work has been translated, of course, there are different kind of historians. But I think what I found a bit paradoxical is there was never any acknowledgement that in the history of the post-colonial, there was an acknowledgement of anti-colonial third worldist writing. But that if we can take a whole body of work, intellectual work, did not exactly exist in Israel, as I suggested before. So this kind of jump into post-Zionism before even an engagement of Fanon, of Memi, what would they mean for this Israel-Palestine context was for me rather ironic, and actually intellectually I found disturbing, because I felt like many of those liberal Israeli intellectuals, or some of them leftist Israeli intellectuals, did not necessarily interrogate their own history, intellectual history.
I think it's time for us to take a couple of questions from the audience, and then we sign the book. You decide who asks the questions.
No, you decide.
Thank you. I have a question for you, because I see you dealing with the cinema only as a discourse or as an ideologic tool. You think we could deal with the cinema only on this level when we talk about this conflict? I mean, there is camera propaganda and there is a cinema. When you speak about cinema in Israel, I am expecting that you are dealing with cinema as an art, not as a propaganda. Propaganda should be out of the category, because this will give me more understanding whether Israel could create a national entity which will be able to express itself or manifest itself in spiritual fields like cinema and art or not. This is one thing. Second thing, quickly, I guess we are dealing about the question of entities behind the scenes. There is a question of entities, conflict of entities. There is entity and process, if I could say that, if Israel will succeed to create its own entity, we could call it now entity and process. And there is another entity, the Palestinian entity, which also is being redefined in the recent context under the Islamization of the conflict of the Middle East. Do you think that such Islamization will bring kind of ethical acceptance for Israel as a Jewish state or not? Because I want to go back to what you said, what we are hearing, that the Jewish problem was not existing in Middle East before 1948. This is completely, I think, not true. Simply, Muslim Brotherhood, for example, in Egypt was formed in 1928. And their discourse is clear against Jews and against non-Muslims. In Middle East, in Arab countries, we never experience society in which religion will be a private matter, a personal matter. Religion is an entity all the time. And this, for sure, will reflect kind of discrimination and kind of marginalization. If we want to think that Middle East passed through modernity and we had a religious reformation and we are talking about societies which are living in measures, Western measures, this is completely not correct, and I guess we need to criticize our history in the same way that Jews and Europeans are criticizing their own societies. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. First, with regards to your first question, the whole point of the project was to say that art is not separate from politics, whether consciously or unconsciously. Art is always implicated in politics, whether the institutions that support it, the communities that receive it, not to mention that the films themselves are narratives about politics, history, even sometimes when this is not their themes, their explicit theme, they sometimes unconsciously or unintentionally project a particular political point of view. And especially early on, in the early part of the book, I was also speaking of unconscious allegories, where some films about alienation within Israeli society could be seen as reflecting larger political processes. I gave many examples of that throughout the book, so I won't elaborate here. But so therefore, the notion of propaganda is relevant to some films, because some films have been produced and financed as propaganda tool all over. All countries and all nation states and institutions have a role in shaping propaganda. And which is why I preferred throughout the book, largely in the first part of the book, to deal more with fictional narratives. My point was fictional cinema also can play a role, whether intentionally or not intentionally, in shaping particular point of view. It's not a direct propaganda, but it nonetheless has a pedagogical role. For example, how Jews should view Israel, especially if they are not in Israel, and why they should come to Israel, for example. With regards to your second point about Islamization and presumably, and I don't agree with how you summarize what Rasha and I were saying, because I think specifically we said we do not want to idealize the history of Jews in the Middle East. And that's what I say throughout the book. However, one of the key problems is the very fact that throughout, in most of those films, the story of Jews in Arab countries and in official Israeli discourse is usually reduced or narrated within Eurocentric terms. In other words, is viewed through what happened to Jews within Christianity and Jews in Europe. And that's actually a very misleading paradigm. I agree with you. We definitely have to have a more complex understanding, and certainly Arab intellectual, and I think for me Rasha represent that kind of move to try to engage the story of Jews within Arab countries in a more complex way, both the tragic parts, but also not reduce it only to tragedy. I mean, that is there. But I also feel that what has happened, and if to go back to some of the examples, Hill 24 doesn't answer, set during 48 war. In the Egyptian army, you have a Nazi, an actual, an actor who plays a Nazi. And so often Arabs have been seen as Nazis, and I think this analogy and the equation between Arabs and Nazi plays a role today. I mean, for those who may have followed, there is an effort to, for example, narrate what happened to Jews in Iraq in 1941, the attacks on Jews at the Farhud, as a story of the Holocaust, and so simply seeing that attack as part of the Arab Nazi equation. So, and in that context, there is a campaign to include that story in the Holocaust Museum. So I actually would argue with that kind of narrative, not to try to idealize that it didn't happen and there were no problems and there were no massacres, etc., and especially in the wake of the Israeli-Arab conflict. I think it needs to be engaged, but it needs to be engaged in a way that does not also reproduces this kind of equation between Arabs and Nazis, that does not also suggest that what was happening in Palestine was not was never a problem or an issue. It was simply Jews returning to their homeland, because what happened is that Jews in Arab countries were caught in a battle or in a project that they were, for the most part, only were part after the fact, as it were. The Islamization is what really you're talking about, the separation of, as it's called here, church and state, or you can say mosque and state, or synagogue and state. It's not exactly clear whether Israel represents, what does it represent either in this question of, so I think this is a legitimate question. And again, I would say, of course, the discourses, and especially what I found troubling in that history is the conflation of Jew and Zionist that has been with us and has, to an extent, to my mind, has to be understood as also having implication for why Jews ended up dislocated from the Arab world. And I'm using dislocated because even the term refugees or the term aliyah, as often used in Israeli discourse, are problematic in itself. In the case of Palestinian, you can clearly speak about refugees. In the context of Arab Jews, in an article, in an essay called Rupture and Return, I tried even to problematize, and also it is in the last part of the book in the postscript, how do we speak about this movement across border? Is it simply aliyah? Were they all Zionist, or did they all want to leave the Arab world? It's not so simple, as we shall see. Not as we shall see, but as you will see if you read that postscript. Okay?
I would also add that you cannot generalize at all about a single history shared between Morocco and Iraq. And you cannot talk, it's very different, it changes. Egypt had a state, Algeria was different from Lebanon, from Syria, from Palestine. And the story of modernity in the late Ottoman era is very complex. Either you want to measure modernity according to Eurocentric terms, or you look at what was happening in the Ottoman Empire from Istanbul to Beirut to Palestine to
religion and the state should be separated or not, simply. Is this Eurocentric? Is Islam an entity, a way of life?
But that was never, okay.
This is a simple question. Don't say Eurocentric, because for me, when you say Eurocentric, you're threatening me. I feel like, oh, wow. No, the question is very simple.
It was never the case. It was never the case.
A way of life.
It's
Islam
not.
should be a way of life or just personal relation between man and the God. Is this Eurocentric? I don't know.
It was never the case. The Ottoman Empire changed. It was never the case. It's okay.
Here.
Hi. I feel a little. This is as a. Now, what am I again? I am an Arabic Jew. I'm an Arab Jew American red diaper baby. Okay. So as all of that, I should know the answer to this question, and I feel a little naive asking it. But I'm absolutely fascinated by certain aspects of the conversation tonight. The hyphen. I want to know more about the hyphen. If the hyphen is about hybridity, as opposed to layering or mutual sort of inflecting, talk about. I'm just curious about the hyphen, because honestly, I've never heard that before tonight.
The
Arab
you mean
Jew.
In the term Arab Jew.
Yeah, with the hyphen in between.
The difficult hyphen.
Yeah, when I wrote about it, it was in a context, and still an ongoing context, in which Arab versus Jew is the operating terminology. They're often posed as antonyms, as the two identities that, as the twain shall never meet. Historically, of course, it is problematic, but also what I was trying to suggest that it is an entity that has existed historically and continue to exist, whether in Israel or outside of Israel. So my critique was of this erasure of the hyphen between the Arab and the Jew. We're also erasing the concept of the Arab Jew, an identity, a history, a culture that no longer allows is no longer allowed to exist in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and especially once those Jews from Arab countries have arrived in Israel and had to undergo a process of Israelization, assimilation, modernization, or so-called modernization and westernization, as if some of them were not have encountered Western culture or so. Obviously, the question of hybridity is relevant not only to Arab Jews, it's relevant everywhere. The question of hybridity is the very fact of critiquing the notion of essentialist cultures and the separatedness of cultures. So I think sometimes, even in my book, the idea of East-West and the politics of representation, the East and West sometimes was understood as if I'm arguing for an essential Eastern identity and essentialist Western identities as separate entities, when in fact the whole point was to critique the politics of representation around such a constructed dichotomy of simply East and simple West. And I think that is, in general, has been the project of what is now has been called post-colonial studies, sort of like undoing those kind of binary categorization of identities. So the hyphen was another mode or another project of, insisting on the hyphen between the Arab and the Jew, was also a way of going against a kind of a political taboo, but also a cultural taboo, in which the culture of the Arab Jews, except for the private, when I was growing up in Israel, it was simply part of the private space. I mean, private space of home, community. Outside of home, if you spoke Arabic, you would be laughed at, you would be ostracized, or you would be maybe even seen as Palestinian. Right. I mean, not that they could tell the difference between an Iraqi dialect or a Palestinian dialect. I mean, that was... so this is the kind of a policing that I grew up around the question of Arabic and identity. So the question of taboo memories was really about the text that I wrote, that is, you heard in the Elie Suleiman homage by assassination, is the very fact that I was raised as a question, even nostalgia, not to idealize, again, the history of Arab Jews, but in the context of Israel, even nostalgia for that past was not permitted. Until, of course, later on, and that's when much of that culture gets to be appropriated and institutionalized, and now is part of the public discourse, but only under this rubric of Israeli culture, or Israeli identity, where that in that kind of permissible way of being an Arab Jew or a Mizrahi now, as long as you pledge allegiance, as it were, to the state, the nation, and do not take on board a Palestinian critique. And that's really the key issue here. But how red diaper was, how the question of red diaper was, I was curious about that. The bio. Okay. It's really a phrase I encountered in New York, because I never thought of some of the Iraqi Jewish communists you saw in the film as red diapers. I never knew that. I know it's an American term. Of course. No, that's what I'm saying. It was never used for communists in the Arab world. Not that I know, red diapers. Yeah. I know, yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Okay.
Hi, Ella.
Hi,
Rasha. Question is, was your book translated to Hebrew, and when? You mentioned about Fanon and others. What about your book?
I'm sorry, what?
What about your book? You mentioned that Fanon was translated very late to Hebrew. What about translation of...
Israeli cinema was translated in 91. It came out with a alternative publishing house with very little money, which the sociologist Shlomo Svirsky, who didn't get tenure at Haifa University, established after he was basically fired for his politics. He was a straightforward Marxist, Israeli Argentinian, and and worked with Palestinians and Mizrahim at the university. He was a good friend, although we had arguments. And one of the key arguments was really around what Rasha was saying before, around the question of Marxism, because I did not feel that Marxist analysis is sufficient to explain the kind of trauma, identity complications. And that's when I started writing in the 80s in the context, as you know. In Israel, there was a discussion around economic discrimination, political discrimination, but not the question of identity. And this really came out of my work and reading of the diverse third worldist writing, Frantz Fanon, and the diverse African American writers, Latino writing. So you have here another intertext that did impact me to start questioning our story also as an identity question. And that's the context. Even though we had argument, Shlomo took the book and decided to include it in his Brerot alternative. It defunct publishing house, does not exist anymore, and accompanied me in that weird tour that I was on in Israel at the time. You know, I can tell lots of stories about, one of them was the TV show that you saw, but there were many other funny stories along the way. One story I will tell because it was in Haifa, and it was in Haifa Cinematheque. And when the director of the Cinematheque saw me, Shlomo knew her from Haifa, she said, "Are you Dr. Ella Shohat? I thought you were tall and blonde." And I think that encapsulates some of this kind of experiences that, you know, to be a Mizrahi, Arab Jewish intellectual in the context of Israel and a woman, and I want to insist, as a woman. So it's almost like I had to have the Ashkenazi men accompany me almost as a kind of legitimization in a context, even though he himself was not exactly legit in academia. Yeah, sorry. So this was the, now you can ask your.
Okay. The second question, and answer me after I'll say a note, please. The second question is, do you see that while in cinema and in reality, the borders are not standing the life of people and the merging and the new forged coalitions, and the Israeli government trying to recreate borders every time?
That's right.
For instance, there is no civil marriage in Israel. For instance, they are building a oriental religious Jews city next to al-Fahim, my city. They keep in place the separate schools. We recently learned about the big demonstration of the Ethiopian Jews who forced the government to put them in schools, in regular Israeli schools, not in one black Ethiopian school, as they were together from all ages. So this is happening in Israel. And if you see it as enforcing the borders.
Yes,
my
absolutely.
comment, just comment before I give, because about religious, like how can a person ask about separating religious from state and defending and wishing and aspiring for an Arab world that recognizes Israel as a Jewish state? This is doesn't like blowing my mind. It's actually the history of the Arabs and the Muslims that shows in their side it is possible to be a Muslim and bring a modern constitutions like the Ottoman Empire did. It was possible to be a Muslim sultan and to build a Jewish state, Mikveh Israel, in 1860 in Israel. The first Jewish state built in Palestine was built by Ottoman money and on Ottoman land. So this is not like, learn your history and deal with reality. Israel claiming a Jewish state is a racist notion, and this is what's behind it. And don't make it like look and sound like a secular thing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Both sides are racist.
Okay.
Both sides.
Few other
Yeah. So I think what we have here, and I think it's, again, an important question, we come back to some of the absurdities that we started with our conversation, our voyage today with Emil Habibi and some of the Palestinians within Israel, having to live the reality of a Jewish state, which is, the present absentees, Jewish democracy. Those are very paradoxical terms, and I think the whole question of how the state was created, where did it come from, which kind of discourses were available. I mean, we go back to the late 19th century and we think of the foundational text, the State of the Jews, Herzl, a Viennese Jew, who obviously represents, and I cite him actually in the postscript, in his utopianist narrative, Alt-Neuland, and Alt-Neuland, I think, encapsulates exactly what you're saying about the very foundational paradox embedded in Zionist discourse. On the one hand, the notion of not simply a place where Jews could go, but a state for the Jews that later gets even to be interpreted as a Jewish state, with its kind of essence, the notion of Jewishness. At the same time, it's a completely secular project, as formulated by Herzl, with the idea of transplanting Jews in this context, in Palestine, but completely reproducing. It's not simply a project of return, because it's also a project of reproducing colonial discourse and bringing the civilization to the barbarian natives. The only good Arab, or the only good Palestinian in the history of Israeli Hebrew fiction, is the Arab who accepts the Zionist project and applauds it. And this is systematic, actually, in the cinema, in literature. So, Charlie Rose, and so from you, and I think it's really important that you also bring up the Ottoman Empire, and that we also bring up the context of German writing, a Jew who writes in German in the context of Europe and is impacted by the Dreyfus trial, because that moment is a moment of trauma, but how it gets to be understood, I mean, this is pre-Holocaust, obviously, but those traumas of Europe gets to be translated, and I think what we have now is you're absolutely right. The whole question of the state is always about implementing borders, and multiple borders in terms of education, the segregationist schooling system for Palestinians, for Mizrahim, for Ashkenazim in Israel. Blood, you mentioned the Ethiopian, even blood was segregated. The major demonstration around this, when Ethiopian found out that because their difference on the one hand, because of suspicion of AIDS, that their blood was segregated in hospitals. So you have constantly those issues that borders are implemented. But what I'm trying to say, that perhaps the utopianist project, for me, is really about undoing multiple borders. And the cinema, you can say, is also a form, not just archival rewriting of the past and revisionist documentaries, revisionist history, but also trying to imagine the future through those different possibilities that around dismantling multiple borders, multiple walls.
Thank you very much, Ella. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.